Hi everyone, this is Casey. I wanted to share a quick reminder that enrollment is now open for the next cohort of my signature Paradigm Shift program. This is the program where I personally coach you through taking action with the essential skills and mindsets you need to support your PDA child or teen and make true progress. After every cohort, I ask parents for feedback, and what they say over and over again is that the program is life-changing. It empowered them to transform their relationship with their child and stabilize their home. You can use the link in the show notes to learn more, join the program interest list, or dive right in and enroll for immediate access. Now, on to today's show. Hi, and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. PDA, pathologically demand-avoidant child or teen, compulsively eat. Okay, so are you a parent who is watching your PDA child eat a bunch of sugar, eat all processed food, only stop eating when maybe they feel nauseous? So this is a pattern that I want to support you with, because even though it's less talked about in the pathological demand-avoidant space, based on what I've noticed in my programs and the families that I've worked with, this is something that is top of mind for a lot of families. So today we're going to do 5 things. I'm going to talk to you about why this is happening through a nervous system lens. 2, what it might look like in terms of in your home. 3, how we can think about supporting this and look to some of the research based on what's called responsive feeding. So I'm going to talk to you about a book that might be supportive of you. 4, we're going to talk about practical things you can do to experiment with a different lens for supporting compulsive eating that doesn't involve restricting or controlling or correcting, which, as we know for the PDA, sometimes makes them fixate more on the behavior because of equalizing. And I'm going to talk about that. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more about the book. Okay, so if you are here listening on a podcast, welcome. I'm excited to talk about this topic. I haven't seen a lot about it written anywhere. So we're going to draw on some of what has been written from the trauma-informed work in responsive feeding, which is often focused on children who have suffered neglect or abuse or are adopted or in foster care, because there's a lot of overlap. So first, go back to basics to understand why compulsive eating is happening. Okay, so what we know about the PDA brain is that there is unique neuroception around losses of autonomy and equality. Okay, what does that mean? That means that, like every other human, PDAers have a part of their brain that I'm pointing to here, which is the amygdala within the limbic system, which is the survival part of the brain, the less developed or reptilian part of the brain. And when that part of the brain perceives on a subconscious level that the person is in danger or under life threat, it tells the body and the nervous system to go into fight or flight, freeze, or shut down. Okay, and every single one of those responses has physiological impacts that impact digestion, impact hunger, impact the sensory system, and that is going to relate to eating patterns, okay, for everyone. But for PDA kids and teens, this perception of threat is happening all the time in a way that's often invisible to other people around them, because it's based on the perception that they don't have freedom, choice, and autonomy, or that someone or something is placing themselves above them in power, stature, or authority. Okay, so if you think about it, if you're in a situation right now where you as a parent are super worried watching your kid come home from school and eat 15 Oreos, your impulse is going to be like, hey, bud, can you slow down on the Oreos? Or as you get more stressed, limiting the Oreos, trying to correct the behavior, trying to incentivize not eating those Oreos, okay? And that's a natural response. However, every time we do that as a parent, unlike with other children who might get annoyed or upset or have emotions around the boundary, for our PDAers, it's activating the nervous system physiologically in a way that they don't have conscious control over or necessarily even understand themselves. So as this is continually happening, not just in the moment when they're compulsively eating, but they're having all of these losses of autonomy at school, for example, right? Like, where they have to sit, what activity they're doing, getting corrected for doing things incorrectly, even small things like having, a worksheet and having to draw inside the lines or start at the top of the worksheet or finish their game at recess on a timeline that they don't want to finish, or they're interacting with other students, and the students sometimes have hierarchies and they're going to be perceiving threat. Okay, so all of that's building in the system at school, and then they come home and they're doing what's called equalizing, which is trying to get the nervous system back to a place of safety. So this impacts basic needs. And what do I mean by basic needs? What we're talking about here is safety, so aggression or violence or harm towards others or oneself, or eating, restricted or compulsive. Today we're talking about compulsive, toileting, sleep, and or hygiene. So this control that they're needing to exert to get back to a place of nervous system safety is manifesting in controlling around food, but instead of restricting the food, they're compulsively eating the food, okay? So we see control often coalescing around one stickiest basic need. So if you're listening to this and compulsive eating is something that's challenging in your family, this could be your child's stickiest basic need, the one that you're most worried about that manifests the most. Secondly, because this is based on a nervous system activation that's repeatedly happening, it does impact physiologically the body, okay? So for example, when we go into fight or flight or freeze, we have mobilization in the system. What does that mean? Adrenaline is released, cortisol is released, our digestion slows down, aren't metabolizing as quickly. We also lose our sense of hunger and or go into a freeze state where we're not feeling anything, which is scary. And then sometimes we can want to compulsively eat in order to get ourselves out of that freeze state, okay? To feel something, okay? So if your child is compulsively eating, it is one manifestation of this mechanism. Control is coalescing around eating, and there are physiological impacts on the body, which can also be causing them to seek out sensation and dopamine through crunchy foods and sugar and snacks. So seeing this through a nervous system lens, how can we understand how to help them? Okay, if we're approaching this, and if it's worked through a traditional behavioral lens, just ignore what I'm saying, because what I want is for you to have something that helps you. But for those of you listening, it probably has not helped. If you've taken an approach that is like correcting them, tracking food, hiding food, restricting food, monitoring food, they are likely going to be fixating on it even more if they're a PDAer, because they're perceiving that threat and then trying to equalize based on the unique brain and nervous system of the PDAer. So it can almost look like a fixation, like they're constantly monitoring when the food is available, when they're going to get to eat next. They're constantly asking for food. You're noticing that they don't seem to stop even when they're full, etc. Those are the types of patterns we might see. Okay, so what comes up for parents around this? They want to explore another alternative to what they've been doing because they can see that it's not working. But then there's all these fears about sugar, processed food, BMI, weight gain, body image, etc. And I'm just going to be blunt. Like parents, there's bias out there. You don't want your kid to be fat because then they'll get judged and they won't have friends and people will make fun of them. Or you're worried about their health, or, you're afraid they're addicted to sugar. Okay. So a lot of research showing that things like BMI and these like obsessions with sugar addiction, which by the way, I get worried about too, actually aren't as concerning as we might think. There are a lot of very healthy, bigger bodies that just because they would qualify as obese according to the BMI, especially in childhood, doesn't necessarily reflect their actual health. I want to recommend this book. It's called Love Me, Feed Me by Dr. Kaja Rowell, a medical doctor and pediatrician who has been working for the last 20 years in responsive feeding. And she speaks a lot to what she calls food preoccupation, which is similar to compulsive eating. And she talks about a lot of the research about body image and BMI and growth charts and how we can actually look at the research so that we're not as worried as parents, so that we're constantly overriding this desire to lower demands or be less restrictive to support them in getting to an equilibrium with eating. So I recommend this book. Yes, I'm so worried about processed foods and the damage it's doing over these years. Yes, I completely understand that. For 2 years, my son only ate popcorn, Pirate's Booty, and Lay's potato chips. And I really did not understand how he was growing or getting enough nutrients. But he's fine. He's okay. He's eating more. We got to the other side. And this is the pattern that I see with a lot of families, that the fear of these processed foods or the sugar prevents them from experimenting with a nervous system-based lens to bring down that overall activation, which is actually what's causing the fixation on foods. So that leads us to the next point, which is an invitation to experiment, which is always what we do here at Peace Parents, which is to not do this as a dogma or philosophy, but an invitation to pick a timeline and experiment as a parent with letting go of some of that correction, teaching, and restricting that is causing even more fixation. So what I often encourage parents to do is to pick a timeline that feels comfortable for you for this experiment. At the end of it, if it doesn't seem to be supportive, you just try something else. Usually this is like a 2 to 3 week experimental window. And this can also support parents, moms whose partners are not on board. If we can frame it like an experiment to observe objectively if things shift on a micro level during those weeks, we can start to get more data about what might actually work. Okay? So I would say first, pick a timeline you feel comfortable with. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then apply some PDA-friendly accommodations for the duration of that timeline. Okay, so what this might look like is providing more autonomy around food. Okay, so this might mean for those 2 to 3 weeks, you are allowing the food that they're eating and just observing, right? And this is going to be difficult because you're going to see them eating a lot, right? Because they're sort of getting to feel what their natural equilibrium is without your correction or restriction, which is putting them into the survival brain. So they can't even interpret their body signals, their interoception. They're just in a survival state, okay? So for the 2 to 3 weeks, one thing we can do is providing more autonomy and letting them eat the things that they want to eat, okay? And I know that feels hard. Number 2, getting into an energy of equality, meaning rather than you as the decider of like, this is what you're allowed to eat, this is when you're allowed to eat it, this is how much you're going to be allowed to eat, which, as we know, every time we're in that energy and action or behavior towards a child who's PDA, they're going to have an activation. They're going to perceive threat. And if we keep doing it, they're going to perceive life threat. And what happens? Then the drive to equalize is stronger and the control around food gets more entrenched. Okay? So those first two things, autonomy and equality. Next, we really want to stop commenting, correcting, and even subtle hints at wanting them not to be eating. Okay? So what that means is you might watch your child have a bunch of Oreos and you want to be like, yeah, I don't know if you need that one. I don't know if you need that next one, or maybe 5 is enough, etc. Okay? So again, this is an experiment. We're going to experiment with not doing that. Okay? So the goal here is to get them back into their thinking brain, back into their senses, and into relationship with you, which can only happen if they're in that frontal lobe. This doesn't mean that you're never going to talk about nutrition or food. It just means when we're reestablishing the relationship and bringing down the threat response over time, we are giving ourselves an opportunity to actually have connection. So we want to get into an energy of, if you want to think of it more scientifically, of a scientist, of like, this is an experiment. My hypothesis is behavioral approaches aren't working. So I am going to experiment consistently and observe if anything shifts over these 3 weeks. And so what we might see is maybe a child who is constantly fixated on food and eats, I'm going to go back to the Oreo example, eats 9 Oreos after school every day. Maybe 1 out of 5 days you see they only eat 5. Okay, so we're going to try and notice small granular patterns. Maybe they say to their mom, I don't know why I'm eating so much, right? When they previously could not engage in any conversation, or if you tried to talk to them about it, it was full shutdown. So we want to look for the data or indicators that we can infer are actually implying that this approach might be supporting. So then finally, another thing we can do is to experiment with deliberate signaling of safety from your nervous system, another safe nervous system. So often a pattern I see in the PDA space when parents are newer to lower demands, it's like, okay, you can have freedom and choice around food, and I'm just going to bring you the food that you want, but then I'm going to let you do your thing and watch your iPad, and I'm going over here to do my work or do whatever, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but we want to get into the mindset of caregiving, meaning we might want to be present while they're eating their food, not to restrict it, but just to signal mammal to mammal safety of like, maybe your kid is under a blanket eating with an iPad, and instead of going downstairs to do your own thing, they're in their bedroom, you sit and read a book within eye and earshot right outside of their door with the door open, right? Because this nervous system safety signaling that's deliberate and mammalian is also helping us get back into more nervous system safety, okay? And remember, if we're going by the PDA lens and logic, the reason they're compulsively eating is not because they're addicted to sugar. It's not because necessarily they have an eating disorder. It's because they're seeking safety and control. Okay, so the more that we can actually address that root cause over time, the less you're going to see those types of patterns, but it takes time. Okay, so just to summarize, we want to start looking at this through a nervous system lens if behavioral approaches have not supported your child or made things worse. What that means is going to the root cause beneath the behavior and addressing that. We also want to be looking at what's happening outside of the moments of compulsive eating and seeing if we can have more accommodation there. Okay, so, if your child's at a public school and is a PDAer and it's like, oh, they're doing great. They're, they have friends, they make eye contact, they're fine. We don't see anything, which is often the case with PDA kids. They're internalizing that threat response because they know it's not safe to go into fight or flight, but it's still registering in the body and building. So once they reach that threshold of what their body can tolerate, then they're going to be fixating on gaining back control or equalizing their nervous system, which is manifesting around compulsive eating. So what you can do is really look outside of the eating and determine okay, actually, I really need to advocate more, because even though they're fine at school, this compulsive eating is causally related to that. Or maybe you're a parent who's well, they're fine at school and they do the thing when I tell them to do it. So you make them do chores and you make them clean up after themselves. But all of those losses of autonomy and equality, even if there's compliance, register in the body, build in the system, and then comes out as compulsive eating. So we really want to understand that cumulative logic over time in the moments that have nothing to do with eating, because if we separate them and don't look at them as holistically related with the nervous system at the core connecting, then we're going to be so focused on fixing the behavior in the moment, we're going to miss the big picture. So again, we want to look towards alternative approaches that put the relationship and the nervous system at the forefront rather than behavioral modification. And we can look to the responsive feeding space, which actually came out of the adoption and foster care space. And I know some of you have that overlap, but I think the basis of the connection, relationship, and nervous system actually has a ton of overlap with the PDA and neurodiversity space. And then this is an invitation to experiment without judgment of yourself and without thinking of it as a dogma or a set of rules or a philosophy that you have to do. And if you decide not to do it, you're doing it wrong for your PDA child, but rather as an experiment with a new lens and some practical tools that you can actually shift things. Thank you all for being here. I hope that this short coffee with Casey was supportive of those of you who are concerned about compulsive eating, and I will see you guys here again soon. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.